Hey, what's going on, APUSH peeps? We have key people to know from period 6 through 9. This is the second half of the course. I'm going to go over people that you could see on the exam in the form of multiple choice, but you could also incorporate to make your essays that much better. All right, before we begin, you know what time it is. It is shout out time. Have to give shout outs to Megan, Katie at UA NOLA. They are in New Orleans. What a great city. Mr. Torres' class in Guadalajara, Mexico. That is so cool. People in other countries are watching these. Mr. DeJoseph's class in Pennsylvania. Mrs. Rivera's Brick Memorial APUSH class. They celebrated Henry Clay's birthday on April 12th this year. Best of luck to you all. You all will do great on the exam. All right, let's jump over to period 6. Some people you should be familiar with. We have Mark Twain. He coined the term the Gilded Age. That is the industrialization of America after the Civil War. Herbert Spencer comes along, and he's a dude that advocated social Darwinism, or the survival of the fittest for humans and businesses. And it's important to know that this was used by the wealthy to justify their success. Do I even need to mention how sweet his beard and sideburns are? I don't think so. All right, industrialists. We have Andrew Carnegie. He formed Carnegie Steel, and he wrote The Gospel of Wealth. And this is the idea that wealthy should give their money back to society in the form of philanthropy or philanthropic contributions. Know this phrase. And here is Andrew Carnegie giving money for the public good. When he gave his money away when he died, he gave lots of money to build libraries and other things that would benefit society. Your synthesis point could be connecting that to a Bill Gates today or a Mark Zuckerberg, these billionaires who have pledged to give away most of their money when they die. John Rockefeller, he was Rockefeller Oil. Cornelius Vanderbilt built some railroads, and J.P. Morgan was in the finance industry, the banking industry. And these guys sought to consolidate corporations by forming trusts or monopolies to increase their wealth and power. When you think of unions, you should think of two. One in particular, the Knights of Labor, led by this dude, Terence Powderly. And this welcomed skilled and unskilled workers, including women and African Americans. And unfortunately for the Knights, their downfall occurred after the Haymarket Square riot, in which they were blamed for an anarchist throwing a bomb. Shortly later, we have the American Federation of Labor, led by Samuel Gompers, and they consisted of only skilled workers. And they focused on bread and butter issues, such as an 8-hour workday and high wages. I don't know why, I just have a feeling you could see unions be a short answer question. Something like briefly explain the reasons for the rise of unions and the impacts of it. I don't know, it's just a hunch I got. So we think of urbanization, think of political machines. In Tammany Hall, the Democratic machine led by Boss Tweed for so many years. And he ended up escaping from the United States because he stole so much money from New York City. Thomas Nast was a political cartoonist, and so many people saw his cartoons, they were able to identify Boss Tweed. Now, the purpose of political machines is they provided immigrants and poor individuals with social services. Hull House, Jane Addams, you know her from Chicago. She helped immigrants adapt to U.S. culture, specifically through language and customs. Definitely know Jane Addams. She is specifically mentioned in the curriculum. Okay, key reformers you should know. Ida B. Wells, she was a journalist from the South that wrote about the dangers and the horrors of lynchings. Booker T. Washington, he sought economic opportunities for African Americans, even founded his own school. And W.E.B. Du Bois, you can see him right here in the center of this picture. Here he is at the Niagara Movement, which ended up morphing into the NAACP, an organization that is still around today. And he saw immediate equality for African Americans, political, social, and economic. Helen Hunt Jackson wrote a book in the late 1800s titled A Century of Dishonor, and she kind of chronicled the treatment of Native Americans by the United States government and much of the deceit and unfairness that happened to Native Americans. Chief Joseph was the leader of the Nez Perce, and he resisted the U.S. government for a while, and finally he gave a speech in which he said, "I am tired. My heart is sick and sad. I will fight no more forever." Immigrants during this time, we know them as new immigrants. These are people who arrived after the Civil War. They're predominantly from Southern and Eastern Europe, in countries such as Italy and Poland and Russia, and they came here to escape religious persecution and poverty and limited social mobility in their homelands. And they tended to settle in cities, and they would work in factories in which they would be accused of taking jobs from Americans. Asian immigrants settled on the West Coast, and just like old immigrants, these immigrants, whether they're new from Southern and Eastern Europe or from Asia, they will face nativism and discrimination. The American Protective Association is similar to the Know Nothing Party and the Chinese Exclusion Act passed in 1882, which flat out barred Chinese from coming to the United States. The Populist Party advocated more government involvement in the economy, and they were predominantly made up of farmers. And William Jennings Bryan, he ran for president in 1896 as a populist and Democrat. He ran for president 3 times and lost. Oh my God, you know it. I had to have Henry Clay in one more video. Even though he was out of this time period, you just had to know that he would be in here. So William Jennings Bryan gave this very famous Cross of Gold speech. This to me is screaming an excerpt for either multiple choice or a short answer question. He said, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." William Jennings Bryan was an advocate of introducing silver into the economy to help out farmers and those that were in debt. So some questions I could see would be something like who would support the point of view of William Jennings Bryan and who would oppose the point of view. Jumping down over to period 7, Frederick Jackson Turner. He wrote an influential thesis arguing that the frontier was closed, and this led to many people wanting to begin to expand overseas. Alfred T. Mahan, around the same time, wrote a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, and this encouraged countries to build up their navies. Rudyard Kipling helped justify imperialism by writing poems such as The White Man's Burden, which he argued it was the duty of Americans and Europeans to civilize non-Western countries. In 1898, the Spanish-American War occurred, and Teddy Roosevelt resigned his position as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to fight in the war, and he was a Rough Rider in Cuba. William McKinley was president during the war, and the Spanish foreign minister trash-talking him in the Delome letter was a reason that the United States went to war. Emilio Aguinaldo, he was a Filipino that fought against the U.S. after the Spanish-American War because he and many other Filipinos thought they were getting independence, so they had a large insurrection against the United States. And finally, the Anti-Imperialist League. This was a group of people that were against acquiring land overseas, especially in the Philippines. And this is made up of people like William Jennings Bryan, Mark Twain, and different presidents of colleges such as Harvard. During the Progressive Era, you should know Upton Sinclair, he wrote The Jungle, inspired the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. Jacob Riis, he wrote a book called How the Other Half Lives, which he took pictures of poor tenements, which led to the destruction of many of these houses, and new houses replaced them. Lincoln Steffens wrote a piece called The Shame of Cities, which detailed the corruption between municipal or city governments and corporations. And Alice Paul, very influential woman who fought for women's suffrage, which eventually came to fruition in the 19th Amendment, and she wrote the Equal Rights Amendment, which would eventually be passed by Congress in 1972, but never ratified. There's another synthesis point for you. John Muir, he founded the Sierra Club, and this was a preservationist organization. So you see people popping up during this time that are seeking to preserve the environment. For World War I, know that Wilson campaigned on he kept us out of war, but then got into war in 1916, and he entered the war. He said the United States was entering the war for humanitarian and democratic principles. George Creel was a journalist, gave 4-minute speeches to support the war. Charles Schenck was arrested and convicted for violating the Espionage Act of 1917, and this was upheld by the court case Schenck versus the United States. And Henry Cabot Lodge was an influential senator, best friends with Teddy Roosevelt. He wrote Lodge Reservations, which were against the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. And this played a large role in the U.S. not joining the League of Nations and rejecting the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. Shortly after World War I, Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer played a significant role in the Palmer Raids, which helped lead to the Red Scare and the deportation of many immigrants. 1920s, definitely know the Harlem Renaissance. It's the celebration of African American culture through music and literature. People like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, you should be familiar with. Marcus Garvey was the leader of the UNIA, and he promoted a Back to Africa movement, and he would later influence Malcolm X, who we'll talk about in just a little bit. And John T. Scopes was a science teacher convicted of teaching evolution in Tennessee. The Lost Generation was a group of writers that criticized middle-class consumerism, similar to the Beat Generation of the 1950s. For the Great Depression and New Deal, Bonus Army. This was under President Herbert Hoover. They were World War I veterans that went to Washington to receive a bonus they were promised, and they wanted to receive it early because of the Great Depression. And Hoover responded by sending in the military. FDR, know him in the New Deal, the 3 R's, relief, recovery, reform. Dr. Francis Townsend, he advocated giving $200 per month to the elderly, and this helped influence Social Security. Definitely no political realignment. This is mentioned in the new curriculum. And what political realignment means is during the Great Depression and New Deal, African Americans and the working class began to vote Democratic during this time and after. Absolutely know that you could see that as an answer for a multiple choice question. For World War II, A. Philip Randolph, he proposed a march on Washington, which led to FDR issuing an executive order to desegregate the defense industries. Women worked at factories during this time. Think of Rosie the Riveter. African Americans also worked at factories. They fought in the war, and this led to the Double V campaign, which is victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. That'll play a large role in the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. Japanese Americans, 100,000+ were put in internment camps for fear of subversion, even though none of them were ever found to be spies. And Mexican Americans, we had the Bracero program, which encouraged migration from Mexico to America to work as a labor source, especially on farms. And then the Zoot Suit riots demonstrated racial tensions between the U.S. and young Mexican-American teenagers. For period 8, Cold War, definitely know George Kennan. He's the father of containment. If you're writing a foreign policy essay after World War II, I can't imagine you don't talk about containment. George Marshall, he was the Secretary of State under Truman. And think of the Marshall Plan, which gave billions of dollars to Europe to rebuild and resist communism. Eisenhower's farewell address, he warned of the military-industrial complex. The Shah of Iran was put in place in Iran after the CIA overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh, who was elected by the Iranian people. And Ho Chi Minh sought to unify Vietnam as a communist nation, both north and south. For civil rights, Rosa Parks, definitely know her as what really kind of started the Montgomery bus boycott. And right over her right shoulder, you see a young Martin Luther King. He was very well known because of the bus boycott, the March on Washington, and so much more, including his letter from a Birmingham jail in which he writes about using civil disobedience as an effective way to fight segregation. Emmett Till was a black teenager that was brutally murdered in the South, and his funeral was on the cover of many newspapers and TV, and it helped many people realize just how awful violence could be in the South. The Little Rock Nine, these were 9 black students that went to Little Rock High School after it was desegregated, and Eisenhower sent in the military to enforce this. And Malcolm X advocated black nationalism, and for a good part of his life advocated separatism, or blacks living separate from whites. Authors to know, Betty Friedan, she wrote The Feminine Mystique, in which she challenged the cult of domesticity. Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, in which she warned of the dangers of pesticides on the environment, especially in water. For Phyllis Schlafly, know that she was the leader of the Stop ERA campaign, and she sought to prevent the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, and ultimately that did fail. The Beat Generation of the 1950s, they criticized middle-class consumerism, just like the Lost Generation. LBJ, he was president during the time of the Great Society, and he also escalated the Vietnam War under the Gulf of Tonkin. And immigrants post-1965. This will overturn, the Immigration Act of 1965 will overturn the quotas from the 1920s, so we see a rise in immigrants from Asia and Latin America. Jumping on over to period 9, Ronald Reagan. He was elected in 1980, and he advocated a conservative government, which was in favor of a smaller government. Here he is at his inaugural address. In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. So he called for a smaller federal government, as did many conservatives. This includes tax cuts, deregulations of industry, and the buildup of the military. Mikhail Gorbachev, or Gorby, he was the leader of the Soviet Union and instituted glasnost and perestroika, which helped lead to the fall of the Soviet Union. And the don't ask, don't tell policy set in place by President Bill Clinton banned openly gay individuals from serving in the military, but this was later repealed by President Obama in 2011. Osama bin Laden was the leader of Al-Qaeda, the group that orchestrated the attacks on September 11th, 2001, and that led to the war in Afghanistan. And Saddam Hussein was the leader of Iraq, and he was suspected of having weapons of mass destruction, which led to the war in Iraq, although no weapons of mass destruction were ever found. All right, guys, thank you very much for watching. Hopefully you checked out the periods 1 through 5 video. If not, check it out in the description. Best of luck on all your exams, especially that oh so important one in May. You will do great. Check out all my other videos in the description. I can't thank you enough for your support. Thank you very much, and have a good day.